Ron Moore. In the making of Outlander, Diane wrote about the long road her books took to the screen. It had to be tempting to many people to take this rich, adventurous story and play it out visually, but because it's huge, complicated, and often written from an internal perspective, attempts to do it in film seemed impossible. Somewhere, she said in this process, though, a lightning bolt hit the biological soup in some remote primordial swamp, and something new stirred in the depths, and that lightning bolt was Ron Moore. Of course, you know, Ron has a sterling science fiction pedigree, 3 Star Trek franchises, Battlestar Galactica, and for Outlander, he brought with him a secret weapon, 2 longtime major fans of the books, his wife Terri and his producing partner Meryl. So he persevered even though there was already an option on the project, and unlike other option holders, no matter how nice or talented or creative they were, Diana says, quote, "This was the first Outlander script I've seen that didn't make me turn white or burst into flame." So the Klingon master had to tackle a race even harder to understand. The Scots. How much closer to an alien race could you get? But and master he did, even wearing his own kilt at times to press events. Ron assembled a team that can't be rivaled by any other TV show for talent. A team that has embraced the mad legions of devotees that the book sparked and the show has fanned into flames. And Ron himself has welcomed fans to come and visit with him before or after with his own favorite obsession, baseball. It's made stars out of young people. And of course, Ron's vision of this massive story has given hundreds of thousands of fans worldwide 4 seasons so far of a fantastic adaptation. It's created thousands of friendships, a huge number of events fans can dive even farther into their obsession with, and single-handedly, I think, kept Facebook in business. It may have all started with the book she wrote, but it expands because Ron made a TV series and gone where no man has gone before. So let's welcome Ron Moore with a little help.
So this morning I say, because you know how you guys kind of like it when you know that we're like regular people? Sorry, am I on? Okay. So, you know, you guys are always like, hey, you guys are just like regular people. So this morning I say to him at about 9, I'm sitting in bed with coffee, what time do we have to be there? 3. We have lots of time. At 1:10. Oops, Deb calls. Where are you? It takes me at least half an hour to do my makeup.
This is how I keep you on your toes.
That's not a good answer. That's really not a good answer. So it's a sitting.
Oh, hi.
Don't try to be nice to her. So it's a good thing that we are here, because I can't actually kill him. There's too many witnesses. Don't you dare. See, she said she'd help bury the body. I like her answer much better than hers.
You need to sit back.
So, as you can see, it truly is a marriage just like every other.
There's no water in this well.
Well, you can wait for the ice to melt. Okay, so, having not reviewed my notes and trying to calm the rage and fury, but is my makeup?
It looks lovely, doesn't it?
Deb talked to me about, would I be interested in interviewing Ron? I was like, this might be the most fun I've ever had.
It will be now.
This morning, he goes, you're not going to get too political, are you? No, not at all. I'm going to go in a whole different direction. No, I'll go back to my notes. But I actually had two questions about us that I kind of wanted to start with, and I'm going to flip them. Okay? So now the first question is, what is the worst fight you can remember us ever having about that? Let's see the next question and understand the flip. Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Well, that's an interesting question.
Isn't it?
You mean about
About outlet that we had a fight about, because there were
anywhere in the show?
so many.
The realm of the show. Yeah.
Andy, what do you consider the worst fight? Then I can tell mine.
I
How about
think.
the first one? How about the first fight, and then we'll do the worst.
Well, I don't know which one came first. The one that sticks out. You were doing a sketch of Claire's costumes back before. I don't even think we'd sold the show.
No, we hadn't. It was still in the. We were getting ready to just put together a concept to try to sell the show.
Yeah.
So this is.
Oh yeah, you're putting the lip.
Was Stars even on? Stars?
I don't know.
I don't even know. It was. So this is like, I don't
Super
know,
early.
6 years ago.
The
7?
costume was great. It was just about how it was drawn, and I just wanted the costume. I knew that the people that I was going to be selling the show to, whoever they were, and I don't think Stars was involved at that point. I just knew that I was taking this project out and going to be trying to sell it to various network executives, and the drawings that she was coming up with were going to be part of that presentation. And I just said the costume, she didn't look sexy enough for the costume.
They know me.
And I just said, look, that's what they're going to, and I said at the time, look, there's going to be the show, and we can do whatever we want when we get the show, but at this minute, we got to sell this, and I need to sell this as like a sexy thing. And we had a huge fight about it.
Oh, it was really good.
It just went on.
I had a fee shoot. This is gonna be a problem. I had a fee shoot. Put it somewhere else.
Is that right? You want to hire?
I don't know, so they can. So I had a fee shoot on it, right? Which would have been, correct at that time.
Yeah.
The worst?
Yes. No, it's good.
Sorry, you guys.
Oh, that's good.
I could probably just yell louder. Yeah, I had a fee shoot. That's later. And he was like, you can't do the fee shoot. You've got it. And I took the fee shoot off and I redrew the sketch, but I didn't draw in the two, the two U shapes, Yes, I didn't draw on the girls, and he was like, you gotta draw on them. Yeah. And so then that went into a giant conversation argument about sexism in the film industry. And how something different on a show that was supposed to not be about that, and why not just lay that marker down now?
Because my point was, well, we got to get the show first. And it was all about, I knew I had done this a long time. I'd gone to a lot of pitches. I tried to sell a lot of shows. And you got to get over that first hurdle. And if you can't get over the first hurdle, you can't do anything. So it was all about, I get it. I understand it's a valid argument. That is what we'll try to do. But I got to sell it. And I need this to help sell it. And it was just one of those things.
How do you think we did on that front in the
Right.
show?
I was very proud of what we did on the show. I think the show is sexy without being sexist or being gratuitously sexist. I think that we fought the battle in different ways. There were times when I think there was pressure in ad campaigns to have the costumes look sexier, or and some of those battles we lost, some of those battles we won. But I think that in the scheme of things, I feel proud of the show, and I'm happy to stand by it. And I don't feel ashamed of anything we did, or feel like we pushed the boundaries of good taste. And I think the show can be sexy without being gratuitous. And I think that's what we did.
So, was that the worst fight?
I mean, there were various internal fights about production and communications and which
Throwing furniture and
things at me.
I know. In his direction, just to make a point. There was chairs back, so I could hit him if I wanted to.
She doesn't have a very good aim.
Actually, I do. I was being kind. Yeah, it was dicey.
There were times.
Yeah.
It was struggle. I mean, this is really the second time we've ever worked together in the project. The first time we weren't married at that point. So, it's a thing. I'm the boss, and so I'm the showrunner of the whole piece. I'm talking in terms of the show. I'm the boss in terms of the show, but I'm not the boss in terms of this. And so that creates
being funny but not. There were many, many, many times when Ron would go, "Why can't you just be like other department heads and do what I tell you?" And my answer was, "Then don't hire your wife." But that actually describes sort of the difficulty of working together and being married, and also in our industry, because it's so intense. It's all you ever do, right? It's 24/7, so it's pretty hard to keep the two separate. Living in different countries helps. Okay, so on just sort of on the subject of us. What do you think is the most romantic story you can tell about us?
on the show.
No.
Probably, our first get together when I told you about the sun, or the light going out. And, this is I've told this story, but I'll tell it again in case you haven't heard it. We were working at a show called Carnival for HBO. She was the costume designer. I was the showrunner. We had this big production meeting where everyone sits at these big giant tables together to go through the whole script, scene by scene by scene. And I remember, and I didn't make this up, I remember very distinctly sitting at the head of the table, and I was looking down to my right where Terri was sitting, and there were a lot of other people, and she was sometimes she would sit forward to
And
do something.
sarcastically quip something.
Yes, and then sometimes she would sit back, and it was literally like when she leaned forward, it was like the light came on in the room, and when she leaned back, the light went out. Just like this morning.
Oh. It's so bad. Never marry a writer. It was really funny because when he told me this story, we were in my office and I thought, and he goes, "I have something to tell you." And I thought he was going to fire me. Because the show was really tough. It was Outlander level tough. And my shorter trailer just burned down. And it was just ugly. And he was like, "Oh, I'm going to fire me." And then he said that, and my response was, "What do you mean by that?"
Yeah.
Ever skeptical. And you said?
Well, I'm very aware that I'm your boss.
Which is some sort of, code for, you can sue me. So I had to say it from there. And 6 weeks later, we were engaged. My most romantic stories are the daily stuff. It's the fact that every single morning he gets up and he makes the coffee, and he brings me as many cups as I need. And at night he gets up and he turns out all the lights and he feeds the cats. I lied. Can I be asleep? No, I'll do it. No, it's the tiny, daily, constant. You know, when Deb had the thing about us holding hands, it's so unconscious. I was like, I'm not gonna hold hands because they're gonna take pictures of me all day long, and I can't. It's automatic with us. What do you think makes us work? Great sex. Cindy, for God's sake. Well, yeah.
And then secondarily, I don't know. We've always had a very easy relationship in terms of we're just like really comfortable in each other's presence. I mean, we just sort of hang out a lot, and we're kind of best friends. I think makes it all kind of flow really well together. It's just a very, I don't know. I never felt like we really had to work hard to figure out our relationship.
No, we never reached. I don't think we've ever reached now, and however many years it is, a point where we get sick of each other.
No.
We can be together for like, I don't even know how many days in a row, and it's never that moment of, I just need some space. Never, and I need space from people pretty quickly. And with him, I'm never tired of being around him. Pretty good. So actually, that's a fairly decent segue into kind of where I want to start with this, which I was trying to find things to talk about that I hadn't heard in a million interviews. And to be able to interview him, who I know so well, is interesting. He asked not to hear the questions ahead of time. But I did ask him, there was something I told you, and you said, oh, that's interesting, no one's ever asked me that before. And I just kind of want to start with, we're in a room, oh, that's you, okay. Mainly women, right? Yeah? I see a few, there's one. There's a whole plethora over there. Okay, but you guys will get this too because it really. All of this kind of goes to our view and how we all relate as women. And so you're making a show that's written by a really strong woman with a fan base composed mainly of women. Your producing partner is a strong woman. Your writing staff is filled with incredibly strong women. Your wife, well. And you have a history of writing really strong female leads, in every show you've done. Laura Roslin, it goes back forever, ever. And the focus that we are all discussing a lot, and we're certainly discussing it in social media, about women in the industry, on television in particular, but also in film. But you're not that guy who's suddenly going out and madly writing a show about women because there's so much pressure. You've been doing it like always, and so it's one of the reasons why I think you're such a perfect fit for Outlander. But how do you count and tell everybody about your personal history and perspective that you think counts for this that's so unusual?
I'm not sure. I don't know that I really have analyze it down to why. I can just tell you how it evolved. I think the first time I was aware that I enjoyed doing it was at Star Trek: Next Generation. One of the first scripts that landed on my desk was a script that eventually became the episode Yesterday's Enterprise. Yes. And the plot of that, for those of you who might not know, it's basically an Enterprise from the past comes into their present, and there's this whole thing about whether it goes back in time to its destruction or not. And in the original spec script that I read, the captain of that older Enterprise was a man, and he came forward, and there was a whole conflict. And I just remember thinking to myself, Well, it'd be interesting if that was a woman captain. There hadn't been any female captains in Star Trek to that point, which is kind of weird. It was just kind of an odd thing that I realized, hey, we never had a female captain. What if we made a female captain for the ship? So I said, oh, let's call her Rachel Garrett, and that would be the first captain in the Enterprise C. And once I did that, I realized as I was writing it, I was fascinated by writing it from that perspective and writing it. It was like, oh, I don't know what that is, but it's interesting. Like, it's interesting to portray this woman as the captain of a starship. And I was sort of captivated by that as a writer. And then what started to happen is just along the road of my career, I would go back to that card every once in a while. Oh, here's a story, here's a traditional story that I said, well, what if we make the protagonist or the villain a woman? Oh, it becomes a different story, and oh, that's interesting. And as a writer, I just kept getting interested in doing that. And it just became kind of a go-to thing for me. Well, flip the gender. It always became a different story, a story that I either hadn't seen before or had a different resonance to it, or the character changed slightly. And I think as a writer, I was always interested in doing something I hadn't seen before or hadn't read before, and it kept me interested in what might have been traditional kind of one-off tropes. When I was doing Battlestar Galactica, when the first weekend I seriously considered doing a remake of that show, I watched the original pilot again, which I hadn't seen in 20 some odd years, and I'd kind of forgotten over the course of time that actually the two leads of that show in the original were Apollo and Starbuck. It wasn't Adama. It was about these two fighter pilots. And so immediately, question one was, what do I do with this? What do I do with the straight arrow, good son, and his roguish card-playing buddy who gets in trouble and has poker games and smokes cars? And I don't know what to do with this. I've seen this 1,000 times. It's a very old chestnut. And I just went, well, but if Starbuck was a woman? It suddenly became different and became fresh. And I was like, oh, I'm fascinated with this character. Who is this guy? Oh, I really want to know what that's all about. And how she became friends with Apollo and just like the whole thing.
Sorry, I want people to see you and them. There, that way I can see you and them.
It just really it revitalized the whole concept of that show at that moment. And then it wasn't that far down the line to go, well, we need a president to counterbalance the military leader of Adama. Hey, let's do it again. If it's a female president, we haven't seen that, hadn't been on TV at that point. I don't even think. I'm pretty sure we beat out Gina Davis's portrayal as president by a year or something. It was in the same area, but it was still something new. And we hadn't seen female fighter pilots in American society at that point. It was just starting to become a thing. Female president was something that was still outside the mainstream thinking. And I don't know, it just always gave me a lever into character in the story, and I just enjoyed doing it as a result. So it just became sort of something that I like doing.
I'm going to push it a little bit further though, because, that still doesn't account for why your view is so different. You grew up in a small rural town. Was there a traffic light when you grew up there?
I remember when the traffic light came on.
And
On the front page of the paper.
And you always describe it as growing it up sort of in the 50s.
Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Chowchilla, California, which is just north of Fresno. It was about 4,500 people when I grew up, and it was very much in the 70s. It was still like growing up in Mayberry. It was still very much a small town of Americana.
So probably not a hotbed of the women's movement.
No, but I was very entranced with television as a kid. I had a TV in my room. I was obsessed with TV, and I was aware of the world around me. And when I was watching, predominantly in the 70s, there was a lot of a lot of syndicated television that had come out in the 60s. And so there was a lot of discussion in the programs I was watching about the women's movement, about the Equal Rights Amendment, about women's liberation. I mean, that was sort of part and parcel of the culture that I viewed through this little window on the world that was outside of my community. And that was just kind of, all those values kind of imprinted themselves on my brain at a very young age.
I'm gonna keep going. Push. That's the story of, probably that an awful lot of showrunners and television writers and film writers can talk about, is growing up watching. You and I talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
I remember when my mother mistakenly, removed pretty much every boundary, and I just started watching TV, and watching all those old movies and old TV series, and so that's a shared story in the industry. Lots of people tell that, and you know, and once again, you're a very singular man in this industry who has. It's one of the things that attracted me to you in the first place. I was like, who is this guy, and what kind of crazy ass views on women does he have? I mean, it was pretty clear right out of the gate. I mean, we met on Carnival, and you know, we you know, there was Adrienne Barbeau was, you know, cast as sort of the sexy lead, and the other sexy lead was a size 18. And, you know, I mean, he just had a very different perspective. And so I'm going to dig a little deeper there and not go to just the television, but were the women that were in your world, teachers? I mean, there probably weren't a lot of working women, right?
No, I mean, it was a farm town mostly, but the women, there were a lot of, you know, they all worked. It was, you know, my grandparents on both sides were dairy farmers. My grandmother and my great-grandmother, I remember distinctly, I always used to go to their dairy farm as a kid and spent a lot of time there. And they worked, you know, they hauled around milk cans and did all kinds of things and milked the cows.
See, this break catches me out of the term.
Well, they were working men. They were all farmers,
Yeah.
and I knew them all, and that was kind of a collective environment in that community. All the farm wives worked really hard and did a lot of physical labor. And then I would say probably in school, probably 80% of my teachers in elementary school and even high school were women. So I had authority figures that were women sort of all the way through. They weren't the principal, they weren't the superintendent. Those were all men. But all the teachers, the authority figure in that class was always a woman.
Yeah.
And I also grew up with a different perspective in terms of what girls could do, because the girls in the class were always the smartest ones in the class, in my class.
Well, they were also that in every class.
They were always the straight A students. The boys were always the idiots. They were always the valedictorians of the high school graduations. And I just grew up with a perspective that girls were naturally smarter than boys, because the guys were basically jerks and idiots like me, and they weren't that. I was one of the smarter kids, but I wasn't the smartest kid in class, and I just always thought the girls were just kind of naturally smarter than boys. And that was legitimately kind of how I grew up in the world.
I'm having a bit of an aha moment because I know your grandmother.
Yeah.
And this is a fierce woman. And, you know, she reminds me of Deb Ford.
And my grandmother was an Okie. You know, she came over from Oklahoma in the Depression.
And when I talked him into coming to this, I didn't talk him into it, but when I said, you gotta come, because you gotta meet this family. Where is this family? Who's the representative here today? Anybody? They're all outside. I said, you gotta meet these people. They're phenomenal. Last time I was here, I was just absolutely blown away by them. And I was thinking about them this morning. I was thinking about Deb and Deanna too, and all of these women who were just working their butts off, right? And so I'm clicking here, I think because I'm here, and because I talk to all these guys so much. And your grandmother, and your stories of your grandmother, of you spending the weekend there. Can you talk about what that experience was when you would stay there and they would get up and what they would do?
Well, you know, they'd get up at some ungodly hour, 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. Before dawn, to go milk the cows, and I was always dead. I lived in town, so I was a city kid. And
which is like 3 streets over. He was always telling me, he was city kid, we gotta get there the first time, and I'm like,
you lived in the country, you lived in town. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world as a kid, to get up before dawn and go milk the cows, and they were always telling me, like, you know, you don't want to do this, Ronnie, you want to sleep in, we'll let you sleep in. And I would construct elaborate traps for them when they opened the door, would ring something about something, so they would wake me up, and I would go out. It was a treat. It was a real treat for me to go out and milk the cows. But my grandmother went out, and my great-grandmother with her. They'd go out and help milk the cows, put them in the barn. They had milking machines, but it was a fairly small dairy. They didn't have anybody helping them. They love those milk cans around. I remember as a kid not being able to lift those milk cans and watching my great-grandmother carry the milk can into the milk house.
So do you think, okay, once again, the definition of working women, do you think that, you know, at a certain point we divided working women into working women who went out, got traditional male jobs, and women who stayed home and took care of the children, which is not a rural view, but a suburban view of women. And so do you think the fact that you grew up watching women, because I've got a picture in my head that's coming up, it's quite extraordinary, of watching a woman get up with her husband and equally go out there and slog and haul, that formed or had part of forming, because your mother did not do that. Your mother was a stay-at-home
Yeah,
mom.
she was originally a school teacher when my father was in Vietnam, and then when he came home, then she stopped teaching, and she was a stay-at-home mother.
So how powerful an influence do you think your grandmother may have been in this?
I think probably a lot. I mean, yeah, I hadn't really thought about my perceptions of, working women and what that meant, but I don't think, I think I still lived in my era, so there was a distinction between what my grandparents and aunts and uncles and family members
What you saw on
worked on the
TV.
farm, and what people did, who went to offices, and those were jobs. That was a
But
job.
maybe that is the difference, is that between you and other, I'd love to get a whole panel of showrunners here and go, okay, how many of you grew up in a rural community? And how many of you saw women hauling giant buckets of milk and doing at 4 o'clock in the morning that perhaps it's not just what you saw on TV, but maybe it's in your own personal experience.
I'm sure it was.
She's one tough. She's fantastic, but she is formidable. She is nobody's pushover.
Oh, she's a piece of work.
Yeah. Grandma Brown.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah. Because what I'm thinking, with the picture that's coming up in my head, is the last episode of season 4. He doesn't have.
I'm trying to remember the last time. And I'll put it together in my head.
The only reason why I remember it is because I talked to you guys, because you guys always like, season 2, episode 305, and I'm like, it's chopping wood and carrying water,
Oh, right.
which is what you should have called the episode. No, but there's a sketch that many of you have seen that I drew that was sort of it was a concept sketch for Claire, and you've seen it, and it's her carrying 2 chickens.
Yeah.
And when I was doing it, it was I really wanted to tap into that dynamic. These are people who are now at work. This is not sitting at home and doing embroidery. This is you're building a homestead, and this is hardcore, and it's a pair of hands is a pair of hands. Your kids get old enough to lift something, they're lifting something, and I think maybe that might have had some impact.
I'm sure it did. I think these are all, informed by a variety of
Yeah.
experiences. Your parents, your community, friends, what you consume in pop culture. I think all these things contributed to a certain outlook of life.
So when you write a woman, when you decide to make a character a woman, when you decide to make the president of colonies a woman, when you decide to make Starbucks a woman, is that just because you find it interesting, or do you think that it brings a different dynamic that you're interested in?
I think it's both. It's fun. It's primarily, that's interesting. I want to do that because I haven't seen it. Let's do something new. The new is always something fascinating to me. On the page or in the writer's room, you're constantly looking for something that hasn't been done, what's new, what's different, and so I'm always drawn to that in whatever form. But then once you've decided it's different, then it still has to sort of change the dynamic in some way. It has to be worth doing. It can't just be random. And most of the time, by introducing a female character into some non-traditional way or in some way that's unexpected, it always changes the dynamics. It always kind of shifts the point of view. It's interesting in Galactica, this is kind of a tangent, but it's related. Both those characters of Rosalind and Starbuck, I also remember when I decided to do that, I also decided that what I did not want to play was, I didn't want to play a universe where that was unusual, where Laura was the first female president, and Starbuck was still dealing with the fact that people didn't think women could be fighter pilots. I just kind of said at the beginning, let's again do something different. Let's have a universe where that's just completely accepted, and they don't even think about it anymore. It's not commented on. They have co-ed bathrooms. It's just like, it's not even a thing, that we would never ever play anybody questioning Laura because she was a woman in the world. They would question her because she was unprepared, because she was the Secretary of Education, or because her philosophy was, at odds with what Adama or somebody else thought that she could do. And likewise with Starbuck, they could think Starbuck was a maniac and a mess and deeply damaged, but it wasn't because she was a woman. And it was interesting that once we sort of wiped that from the slate, it allowed the characters to just be the characters. They didn't have this other freight. Now that's not our book, so it became
I'm about to jump.
different thing. It then wasn't really an analogy for our society. It became a different society, and you were telling a story about a different world that operated by different rules.
So, what a perfect segue, because I then will jump to Outlander. Before I met Ron, and somebody had said to me, what traits are you looking for in a man? And I did a long laundry list of traits, and she started laughing. And she said, well, that's awesome, but men like that aren't very common. And I always listed, it's a feminist wish list, sort of, and she said, would you consider, dating somebody a bit younger? And I was like, well, I never have. And she said, because men like that were raised with women who went out and worked, and sometimes that affects their perspective. And that was around the time I was reading Outlander. And I have, as all of you know, I've said many, many times that what profoundly impacted me, and pisses the hell off people when I say it, some people, that, here was this really strong, independent woman, and she meets a man who's younger than her and fairly inexperienced with women, who then accepts her as she is. He doesn't know any better, perhaps. But he's young enough and he's unformed enough that he just falls in love with her as she is, and he's not trying to push her back into some sort of mold. And I'm wondering how, because everybody knows the story about Outlander, and I made you read it, and how much of everything you're talking about played into Outlander for you when you read it? I mean, because you're bringing that unusual perspective of that history, that Laura Rosalind, and that Starbuck, and all of those characters, and Outlander lands on your table. How much do you think? What was your response to it from that perspective? Have you thought about that?
A little bit. I mean, I was drawn to the female character. Claire was just a great character on the page, right from the beginning. And it's told in her voice, it's her story. Especially the first book is primarily.
It's really backwards.
Are they? Well, it's her story, and it is her story in the book. In the first book, especially, it's told from her perspective, her point of view. So when you're reading it, when I was reading it for the first time, I read it as a piece of material. I never had the moment of reading it.
I'm going to interrupt you because I want to say something about that, because I'm the one who hears all this stuff on social media. The whole thing about it not being Claire's story and what Diana said about that. But remembering that when Ron read it, he doesn't know any of this, right? So he's just reading it from a purely, okay, I'm just reading a book. So your impression from reading that book was that at that point it was Claire's story.
It was her story from my impression of reading book one. And clearly Jane's a huge part of that story, but it was her story, it was her voice. You're listening to her continuously through the 500 pages or whatever it is. And I liked her. I thought she was really smart, which was the big thing that drew me to the character. I thought she was intelligent, and that her intelligence kind of informed everything else about her. It informed her strength of character, it informed her bravery, it informed her ability to adapt in this world, it informed, her sexuality. It was all, she was a very, very smart, intelligent woman, and I liked that character. It's like, oh, I want to write for that character. It was kind of a quick, my immediate impression was I just like writing, I would like to write for that character. And then the second impression was, oh, the world's fascinating, it's really detailed, I don't know a lot about this world. Again, here's something new and different that I don't know much about. That's fascinating. I can see how this becomes a TV show.
And again, something you may or may not have heard about. 'Cause I actually don't tell him a lot of the stuff I read. No, I don't even, it's just, he's not that into the social media thing, which is a question I'll ask him about later, but I find it fascinating because, I'm like a sponge for people's opinions. But there is a lot of discussion about the hyper focus on Claire, and that by doing so, you're emasculating Jamie.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the case. I certainly don't think so. But I am putting that forth because I think that when you're exploring the conversation we've been having so far, which is about the portrayal of very strong women, you then have to go to, okay, so then how do men incorporate into that? And how do you tell the story of a romantic relationship with two people that one is a very, very strong woman without falling into the stereotype, which is that what happens to the man if he's with a strong woman? Now we can all know what we think about that. But, did that, I know you don't, do you know that that's a thing?
Yeah, I've heard that. I mean, I don't, I obviously don't agree with that, or we wouldn't do it.
Right.
I don't, like I said, the first book is told exclusively from her point of view. So as we were going through season 1 of the show, we were aware that this is bigger than just Claire. It's not a completely sole focus on that character. It is also Jamie's story. So that's why mid-season, we made that moment where we suddenly shifted Jamie's point of view, and we had him bring the voiceover, which we did as a deliberate sort of like, okay, we want to tell the audience, beyond the book fans who knew it, but tell the audience that generally, okay, it's really about the two of them, and so let's include his point of view, and let's start doing what are called open scenes. And open scenes when you cut away from your primary protagonist and show things that person wouldn't know. So we deliberately opened up the show at that point and started doing more scenes that were just Jamie, not necessarily with Claire, and it gave the show more breathing space. And I think from that point, in the writers' room, we're always focused on the two of them. What are their stories? And we had a path to go down from the books, but you had to kind of build out. We found that it was, if anything, it was challenging to build out Jamie's story at places, because there were times, like in book 2, for instance, in the Paris story. In the book, that's told predominantly through Claire's narrative again, and there are times when Jamie just leaves and goes off camera, off page. He just leaves, and then he comes back and he tells Claire some things that happened to him off camera. And in the show, we were like, well, that's not going to work. We can't do that. So we had to sort of construct a story that wasn't really in the book to give Jamie more play, to give him more story. So we were always at pains to try to balance the two. Once we had sort of like established it's Claire's voice from the beginning. Okay, now we're going to expand and include Jamie, but we're still on this road that's been laid out for us. And we were always trying to balance the two to make sure he had enough to do, even though sometimes she's driving the story just by getting the story that we've been handed to tell. But I know that we've never tried or wanted to emasculate Jamie. And we've always, everyone sort of jokingly in the writers room call him King of Men. It's like, it's hard to emasculate King of Men. It's like,
well, there's a lot of chat that you take Claire's lines and Jamie's lines and give them to Claire. Do you do that?
Not consciously. I mean, I'm sure there are probably instances where that happens because, again, an adaptation, it's a moving target, and I think everyone who does an adaptation would do it slightly differently. And I'm sure if someone else did the adaptation, they would take a very different tack on it the way I did it, and the way we as writers are going to do it. Sometimes you are moving lines around and you go, oh, we'll give this to them. That happens even at the script level. I mean, we'll rewrite scenes sometimes and you'll go, oh, well, that was a doodle, let's give that to Rupert, you know, and vice versa. There'll just be times when the plot feels more comfortable, or, oh, we haven't had enough, that person hasn't said enough, let's throw them a line that was originally for this person. That just kind of happens. It's not, I'm very comfortable saying that's not a conscious creative choice.
Because interestingly, one of the most fascinating things, you know, God, I love family. I mean, it is just an incredible world, and what's one of the things most fascinating is that every fan thinks that they represent fandom, or a lot of fans think that they speak for fandom, and in any given day, I can read that you're an incredible sexist, and you are the one responsible for diminishing the female characters on the show.
So I dig chicks, man.
I'll take Grandma Barrel about that. Two, you know, all of us, but particularly you, are pushing a feminist agenda and a modern, you know, political, you know, view of the world.
Do it. Good.
What do you, you know, does that impact you in any, I know it doesn't impact you, I don't even need to ask that question, but what do you think of that perspective that the show gets used to push some sort of social agenda, which is something you really work against? I know.
You know, it's tough. I mean, I feel like it's tough to comment on because I really do believe, you know, art is in the eye of the beholder, and I think that whatever the audience's reaction is valid. You know, you like it, you don't. I'm not here to tell you that perspective is wrong or what you take away from it is incorrect. I know what we do on the inside and what our intent is, and so I'm comfortable standing by that.
What do you do on the inside?
On the inside, we're just trying to tell a really good story, and I think that, you know, you can make the argument that there are no choices that are not political, and there's a political choice in everything you do, which I think there's validity to that, and I think that.
Well, we are making this particular show at this particular time in history, so it's very easy for people to go, oh, they're doing it because they're doing this.
We the writers live in the world, you know, we live in this culture. You can't not be influenced by the world you live in. So I know that we are all influenced by, you know, our views of society, our own political ideas, our own notions of society and justice and social mores and all that. And that cannot help but be part of the work itself. But I do know that we don't sit around and decide this is our agenda or this is our political point of view. That conversation just never happens in the writer's room. You know, we'll have conversations about, well, okay, how do we address slavery? How do we address Native Americans or American Indians in the show? Because, you know, the books are written in a different time, when a different time culturally.
About a different time.
About a different time. And how do we want to present that? And we'll have conversations about, okay, let's be cognizant of the world that we live in and what we want to do. But even that conversation is not driven by, well, here's the statement we want to make. You know, here's where we're trying to push, and here's the point of view that we're just trying to be aware and try to be sensitive to ideas that are out there and people and, you know, how the culture has changed, because the culture is also our audience. So we're going to present this piece of art to an audience that also lives in that world. And we want them to, you know, appreciate it, and we want them to be moved by it. There's times we want them to be challenged by it. There's times we want them to be upset by it or cry or laugh. And, you know, you have to understand where the audience lives in order to you know, get the best response from the audience.
How do you, that's an interesting thing, that line that we've had to walk on the show, which is, I think not just our show, a lot of shows, but in particular a show about history. You know, it's you know, you and I have talked about that time, moment when they were trying to take all the cigarette smoking. They were trying to go back in and edit out cigarette smoking from films that were made in the 40s and stuff. And it was like, but people smoked. You know, that we erase everything and pretend that it never existed. And you know, we've you know, walked into some places because we're portraying a period of history that people don't want to know about or don't want to see portrayed on the screen. how do you guys handle that in the room? I know, that doesn't impact us who are, doing costumes and sets and all of that.
We just argue it through. A writer's room, at least in my experience, is a place of great debate, passionate arguments on all sides, and somebody ultimately has to say, okay, well, this is the way we're going. That's kind of my job as the showrunner or the head writer if I'm in that room. But you just have a free-flowing debate about it, and people have their points of view, and ultimately the showrunner, whoever the showrunner is, has to pick a point of the compass and say, well, this is the direction we're going to go.
Do you take into account what the place the society's at, and like how much of this can we portray before people get upset?
Sure, but at the same time, I think ultimately I kind of am more of a selfish writer or a narcissistic writer, whatever term we want to use, in that I'm the first audience, and I kind of feel like I go with my gut. This is what I want to do. This is how far I want to go in this scene. I've talked in the past about when we were working on the Wentworth prison stuff at the end of season 1. It's pretty tough stuff. How much of that were we going to show on camera? How far was too far? When did it become gratuitous, and when did you pull back so far that you had taken all the teeth out of it? And I just had to go by my own instinct and say, this is my judgment, and I'll stand by that. And ultimately, in all things on the show, the buck stops with me. If there are things you object to or things that you're not happy with, you can blame me for that, because ultimately somebody has to make that call, and I'm comfortable making those calls. And that's just the way the show has to work, is somebody has to sort of make a decision and say what it is. I try to keep in mind, what is the show saying? What am I trying to say with this piece of material? What does this scene mean to me? But it's a very subjective thing, and people can have a variety of opinions about whether I made the right call or not. All I can tell you is that those calls are made out of a genuine desire to do the best piece of work that we possibly can. And I think that's the only barometer that I can have, is what is the best story? What is the best scene? What is the best version of the show? And I'm always kind of comfortable feeling like if I've done that, and people object, then that's fine.
I think one of the most I guess it's enough time now. I think one of the most powerful things I learned from you was, it resonated for me. I think we met on this point, but you give voice to it in a way that's interesting, which is about truth, and that has really impacted me in terms of my decision-making process, because what I do is a version of what he does. What Gary does is a version of what he does. Each team goes off and does their thing. And when you work with somebody like Ron, then who has that perspective, then you are able to carry that through. So it's about truth. And when, what you just said to me is that is your truth. And you have always said to the people who work for you, tell the truth. And that then informs, like for me, that informs everything from, doing the Eastern Woodland Indians was how do I find the truth? And how do I tell the truth when there's, it's a difficult thing to do? Or something as small as fern, right? So I don't think I've told you this, but there's swirling little mini controversy gates about the use of fur on the show. And so sort of the agreed upon thing was, we'll say it's fake. It's not. And, I was talking to whatever, it's fake. It is vintage, but it is real because it is the 18th century. And and Ron will always say, respect the audience. Don't lie to the audience. Give them the truth. And the truth is, in the 18th century, people killed animals. They ate them and they wore them. And it's not that now we don't do that. We don't go out and kill a raccoon, eat it, and then put it around it. We're not in danger of that anytime soon. So I think that's a powerful way to tell story. And then but you run the risk of whatever the group is, getting pissed off about it. Be it fur, or be it too much rape, or be it depiction of slavery, depiction of Native Americans. We knew we were gonna be,
That just
missing
comes
somebody
with
off.
territory. I mean, don't do the work then. Don't be in the business if you don't want to deal with that, because that's just part of the game. People are going to, they're gonna have their you guys, is it too hot? You haven't seen a lot of that. Is there anybody who could figure out how to turn down the heat, maybe?
All the fans. Sitting on her own. Wow.
Anybody who knows anybody? Yeah, maybe it's probably
So I think one of the things, this kind of, again, segues in nicely, that everybody would like to hear, and I don't know. I'm always on social media trying to explain your process. Like, okay, the showrunner says this, and then they decide the story, and then it goes to the writers, and the writers go off and do it, because people get really focused on, oh my God, this writer gets the show. This writer really understands, because they did, as if each writer just goes off somewhere and writes whatever they want. Which is not what it's like. But can you, talk about, what the process is, and then how you guys, yes, painful, how you guys, for the first few years of our marriage, I kept saying, this is not a writer's room. We don't have to debate every point. But, what the process is, and then when you're, and move that into when you're looking at a 500-page book, 5 of them, 10 of them, 3 times, the book won't ever stop writing. How the process of the writer room works, and then the process of adaptation, which is, I think, something that people don't know.
Well, the process on our show has pretty much been the same from the beginning. At the very beginning of the season, step one is we have our crack staff, our assistants and production assistants. They go out and they break down the book that we're whatever book of the season is, and they break it down into what we call the tentpole moments, the big things that have to happen in this book. And we have them put them up on a big white board. And
so what would that be?
well, in season 1, Claire with Frank established her in Scotland, goes through the stones, meets Blackjack Randall, encounters Jamie at the cottage, is taken to Castle Leah, meets Dougal and the column, etc. And you kind of, the big things, right? And so lay out all the big things on a big board for the whole book. And then step 1 is to cut that up into hours. So season 1 we had 16 hours. Subsequent seasons we've done 13. But that's the thing. You start looking at that and say, okay, let's try to arrange this into some general sense of an hour. All right, episode 1 in the pilot is probably going to be establish Claire, establish Frank, take her through the stones, meet Blackjack, maybe meet Jamie, right? 2 is, going to be Castle Leah, and you kind of like group them. And you kind of went through the whole season like that, kind of group them generally. Then once you've got an overall structure of the year, the next step is you drill down into a specific hour. Okay, now take everything off the board except episode 1. Now the staff brings out a much more detailed scene by scene breakdown of every scene that was in the book for that section of the story. And they would put those in. And then we would look at that and start. That's when you start really, that's what's really called breaking the episode, which is a term that's used in writers' offices all the time. You break the show. So you sit together as a group, and now is the actual work of structuring it. Because now you've got these collection of scenes that aren't really an episode. They don't really have a shape yet. There's not really a through line. And you discover that there's a lot of scenes you're not going to do.
And I'm going to interrupt you. These are the scenes, right? These are all the scenes where Jamie says this to Claire. Blackjack does that. All those little moments that fandom and book readers are in love with. right? When so-and-so says these 5 words. And you now have a collection of
We have a
all
collection
those
of
moments.
scenes and moments, and not really dialogue. I mean, it's really a
Right.
description of
But
the
the
scene.
dialogue from the book would be within that scene.
Yes.
I'm building a bridge here.
But kind of quickly you start realizing that you can't do the scene, you can't translate it directly to the screen. If you really think about, I'm trying to remember myself, but if you think about the beginning of the first book, there's a lot of little scenes of Claire by herself, and Claire with Frank, way before she ever goes through the stones. There's all kinds of things and flashbacks and meanderings and stuff that Claire was doing up in Inverness, that when you really laid it out, that would have been like almost 50 pages of script, which means it would have been almost an hour just in that section before we even got to the stones. So that was, we went, all right, so we're not going to do all that. So you start condensing. You start saying, okay, what's the essential story? What of those, all those little things that Claire was doing in Scotland before she goes to the stones? Which ones of those do we want to do? What's important to the story? What is the story that we're telling? Okay, it's about establishing her as the combat nurse. Oh, that's not even in the book. Oh, let's see that. Instead of just talking about it, let's actually see her as the combat nurse. Okay,
So this is one of those things where you're adding something that isn't in the book, and people get kind of a little freaked out about that. So, because that means you're not doing, instead of a scene that was there,
Yeah, you're doing a scene of work.
you're doing a scene that wasn't.
Right.
Because,
Because you felt that was an important way to tell it dramatically as a television episode. The books have a luxury of time, that they're hundreds of pages, and Diana is speaking to you, the reader, directly, and she can just diverge, and she can digress for dozens of pages, right? And we just talk about something else, and spend a lot of time talking about agriculture at the time, talking about medicine at the time, talking about all kinds of fascinating, really interesting things. But you can't do that in a TV show. It just doesn't work. You have to kind of present the drama of the moment, present the characters, present the story. So we distill a lot of that stuff into scenes that we feel are capturing the spirit of what that section of the book was about, or what's important to know about the character for the audience who doesn't know the book, which is another huge component of the job of adaptation. Everyone in this room, we could shorthand all kinds of stuff and just, we don't have to tell you who these characters are. You know who the characters are. You're waiting to get to the good stuff, right? But there's a huge chunk of the audience that doesn't know from Claire. It doesn't know who she is. Who's this guy? What does this mean? What's this show about? Is this a show about her and Frank? Oh, it's a show about these two. And they're both going to go through the stones or something. Oh, no, wait, he's not. And so it's all, you have to kind of keep both of these audiences in mind. There's the audience that knows what you're doing, is looking forward to things, and then there's the audience that is just watching a show. And they need to understand who the characters are, and they need to kind of get a sense of the story. So when you're breaking the story in the writer's room, you're trying to keep both those things in mind as you're deciding what's in and what's out, and what gets changed, what gets added, what gets deleted, what is massaged into a slightly different form in order to tell the story coherently. One of the things we did in that first pilot as well was Claire and Frank go to Castle Leah, right? Which was not in the book. Like, that was something we invented because it was interesting to us as writers to have that echo. Oh, it'll be really cool if they go to the castle and we see it as a ruin, and then she's going to go back in time and she's going to go to the same castle, and it would really cement to the audience this notion of time travel and the sort of weird things that are happening, Claire. So that didn't feel like it violated the spirit of what the book was about, or their relationship, or the characters of the story. It was just a nice change. It was a nice way to adapt the existing material into something that sort of, served all the above messages.
okay, so you've now broken down the story into those little scenes. You've picked out the right ones. Now what?
Well, ideally, what you do is once you've broken the episode, you've got a structure. You've got every scene of the show. You've structured it. You've argued. You've moved things around. You've decided this is the episode.
For the whole season, pretty much.
Well, you go through each individual episode.
Right.
And time means you're probably not going to do this for all 16 or all 13 until later. But at the beginning, you're doing it for a discrete number of episodes. And then each individual writer takes that episode and goes off and writes the script.
So you choose the writer you think is most.
It's usually a writer will exhibit a preference for the show. A lot of times in the room, there's the writer who clearly is dying to write that episode. Unless there's a reason why not, you usually try to give it to them. I mean, there is a batting order to an extent. You have to, because of time, you can't. It's really hard for a writer to do 2 episodes in a row. It can be done, but it's straining. Now it's hard to write that much material and rewrites and production. So generally, each writer writes 1, and then they come back around their rotation and write 4 episodes later or something. It's kind of ideal. But nonetheless, that writer goes off, writes that script, turns it into me and the writing staff. We all read it. We gather internally, give notes. I give specific notes. This works, this doesn't work. Sometimes you read it and go, wow, we need to go back to the board and re-break this show because this show really isn't working at all. But most of the time it is kind of working, and they'll do a rewrite or 2 internally. Then it gets sent to the studio and the network. The studio and the network then weigh in their comments, what they like, what they didn't like. It gets rewritten again, and it's just kind of rinse, wash, repeat of writing, reading, writing notes, on and on and on, all the way through production. Because once it gets handed to
Then
production,
they give it to us, and we go, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Because you've taken so long doing all that stuff, we can't, we can't burn somebody at stake.
The production, there's whining from production.
We were in the car once, and I heard him, and I'm always in the car being silent while he's on some big call, and he's going, don't worry about production. They'll handle it. They always do. I was waiting for him to get off the phone. Excuse me.
In production is a very big catch-all term. It's everything from individual department heads saying what they can and cannot do on a particular episode within the time allowed, to the larger budgetary constraints. Okay, this episode is now, it boards out to being 3 days.
Boards
long.
out, I mean, they make these giant
Yeah, these
boards
big boards
with every single scene is slotted in and where it's going to shoot and how many
And this
days.
is going to take 3 or 4 days more than we have allocated. You need to cut pages and scenes that will get us back into a shooting schedule. Oh, the episode's also $200,000 over budget. You've got to find ways to save $200,000 budget here. It's a complicated.
And can you find the location that it's going to
Different
shoot?
location.
Can Gary build it in time? Can we make those, 200 whatever costumes that have to, all those things, now it moves into this just massive place, which then comes back to him again to redo.
Yeah, how do you do that is a whole skill in and of itself. In the wedding episode, Claire, there's a reason why all that activity happened within a certain, when the guys are off getting the clothes and getting the ring and all that, it all happened within a place that we could go shoot. So that was very, thank you. That was good. That was a good one. That episode went through a lot of change. There was a lot of rewrites. There were a lot of editing changes. It was a difficult show to bring off for a variety of reasons, but it was also a very, very important episode in the life of the show. So I was willing to go through a lot of extra work and a lot of extra turmoil to get that one right, because I knew it was so critical to everything else we were doing. And frankly, yes.
It was a huge deal. It's the only time we've ever done that. We shot an episode to make sure it was right.
The reverse of that, though, is that there are times when I'm not going to do that on a certain episode. There's times when I'm going to go, yeah, we're cutting that scene. We're going to cut this, we're going to cut that, and we're just going to have to live with it because this episode is not critical to the life of the series. And I've got 16 of these things to produce, and each episode can't be a hill to die. I've got to make choices.
And each scene can't be a hill to die on, and each line of dialogue can't be, and that's disappointing for a lot of the time when people are waiting for that particular moment.
And I get it. I have books that I love that are turned into movies and TV shows, and I'm disappointed too, because as a reader, I know what I loved about that. I'm waiting for that moment to happen, and it doesn't happen. And that's hard. I totally understand.
You and I both know, and I think everybody here knows, you couldn't do, and I've said this myself on social media a few times, 1,000 times, that you can't do a literal representation of the book. And then people go, well, then we just have longer, the show would go on, be on air for 35 years. Oh, that's great. No, because it would take an entire season to do one chapter. Why can't you do a little representation? Why is that not a possibility? Well, because it would be 35 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long the audiobooks run.
Well, somebody told me a fascinating thing the other day that the first book is 44 hours. Yeah. So that would be 44 hours. And I said that exact thing out there on Twitter. And somebody went, that sounds great.
That's not even how long it would actually, if you really did that, if you really want to make it literal in every sense of the word, right? It would go longer than the audio because there's things that you can write.
That you can write faster than to shoot.
He ran up the hill. Well, okay, it's one sentence. You can actually show him run up the hill.
That's a day of shooting.
It's probably 2 or 3 minutes on camera, so you've already everything. The Civil War happens, it's just like, oh. When you see it, it just
Do you
takes
think
a
it
while
would
to
be
watch the
interesting?
characters.
Creatively, what would you think of that?
I think they're different mediums, and I just think it's a mistake to try to compare them. They're different mediums. It's a different experience. You're reading a book, the author is talking to you, right? You're listening, and you're taking it in a different way, and it's also asking you to imagine it. You're working as you're reading. There's effort involved. You're imagining what she's talking about. You're picturing the castle. You're trying to imagine what these textures are like, and the colors, the way the air, the wind blew Jamie's auburn locks. That alone is like an hour. But it's requiring you to participate in order to read. And television is not that way. We are showing it to you. It's a different experience. There's a difference between being an audience member and being a reader. And they're just not the same thing. So I can't replicate it.
It's interesting. I read a few blog pieces recently, which is they're fascinating me in season 4 of Beth Wesson just didn't run, where it's a sort of okay, I guess this isn't going to be the book. And it's taken 4 seasons for us to get to that point. Everybody's still going, damn it. And it's like, well, I guess they're just not going to redo the book. Now, can we enjoy this?
The book, fundamentally, the show also has its own story and its own integrity to what we're doing, right? Our characters, the further you get down the line, the more they're slightly different from the book characters because we have actors portraying them.
And they have
Sam is not exactly like Jane. Sam is our version of Jane, right? That is slightly different than He's perfect, and he's perfect for the show we are telling.
And it is an amalgamation of what has been written for him, and let us not forget what he himself and Katrina brings. They're not. I've read a lot of things like people say, well, they just put on whatever you tell them. It's like, good God, that makes your life so much easier. They don't. They're like, I hate that. And you have to honor that, right? You have to, and on set, they're like, that line doesn't feel right to me. That's not.
They're interpreting the character.
Yeah.
Sam and Katrina both, the entire
Every
cast
cast
has an interpretation of
cast.
these characters, right? And we have to allow them to have that interpretation because that's what makes the show live. It can't just be a literal transliteration of what is our
Because the life goes out of it.
The life will go out of it.
The creativity dies. I tried that at the very beginning. I said that before. I sat down with the book and I took every costume description and I tried to draw it out, and I was like, doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Now, I read the book 1,000 times, and the costumes were fun. But once I tried to put them into a visual, it was not the same thing, it's not the same piece. I'm totally not keeping track of time, so I have no idea. Good.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you, that's great.
So let me. He has trouble with that. It's like, yeah, well, you didn't marry that girl. Okay, so I just, before we turn it over to the audience, I think in a way this whole conversation has been about all of you, in a sense, and what I hear you all asking all the time. And now we have the horse's mouth sitting here. I'll leave it at how. But I want to talk about fandom, because I learned a lot. When I started in this, and I was a little terrified, I was like, oh my God, 20 million women read this book. And also, I am somebody who believes that you do not, or believe, and you guys have all been there for my spoiler battles, that you do not reveal how the sausage is made, right? And let the audience experience it on camera. Do not pull back that curtain. You're gonna ruin it. And he was like, let them in. Let them in. And the last convention, when I realized there was no room service, this convention, and every time I wanted to go downstairs, people were gonna cry in the elevator, and I was gonna have to, before I got to the coffee, there would be 90 million selfies. And he said, embrace it. Embrace it. What you do first night? Go down and buy everybody around the gin and tonics. And he has taught me so much about fandom that has really expanded my view, and everything I was talking about last night about how grateful I was for all of you when I've gone through what I've gone through and how inspiring you've been and your support. Everything has meant so much to me. Really, the genesis of that came from you. And you're teaching me about fandom, because I thought they were kind of crazy. And I've never been a fan of anything. We've had fights about this. And it's like, you are, you're a snob. And I'm like, I'm not a snob. I just have never, and my kids, both of our kids are like total geek fans of countless things. And we've had many dinner table discussions about this, with them looking at me like I'm the alien. Like, wait, nothing? Not even like the Rolling Stones? I like a band. I don't buy paraphernalia, So we've had lots of conversations about this. So I want you to talk about fandom and your history with it. I mean, because that's like, what would you say the first thing you were ever a fan of? It's got to be pre-Star Trek, right?
It was, it was a space program. It was an American space program. I grew up, I remember Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. I watched the Apollo missions as a little kid. I was obsessed with them, and I was a fan of the space program. I wrote letters to NASA when I was in and they sent me back these beautiful color photos and things. It was amazing. And I was a fan of space, and that turned me on to science fiction, which led me to Star Trek. And Star Trek was the first, okay, don't
How
kick
old were you?
around. I probably found Trek when I was in the 4th grade, something like that. I want to say it was syndicated. It was on every day after school, 5 days a week. I was obsessed with it. I recorded the episodes on a cassette recorder, and I held them on TV, and we listened to them at night.
And those still exist in the Ron Moore Memorial Room in his parents' house. The first time I spent the night there, we slept in the Ron Moore Memorial Room. And there's all Star Trek plates, and every single script,
I didn't
and
know that there
all
was
those.
fandom.
What you what?
I didn't know there was such thing as fandom.
But you were. I mean, this is what I'm saying. My point is that that those audio tapes,
Yeah.
they still exist. And it's wild when you go to your parents' house and they start your Christmas ornaments. And so you were 9, which is about the same age our son was when he became a Star Wars nerd. So it's a very similar thing.
It is, and I fell in love with that show, but I thought it was my show. I didn't know anybody else liked it. And I wasn't until I saw a copy of Starlog magazine on a drugstore shelf.
How much later?
That was maybe a year or two later, and there was a cover of the characters at a Star Trek convention, and I was like, what the hell is that? I was done by it. I never went to a Star Trek convention when I was a kid. They weren't anywhere near where I grew up, but I became aware that there was this culture out there that loved the show as much as I did, and made their own props and costumes and sold things. I found a mail order catalog, that I could order bumper stickers and posters and all that stuff, and I loved it. Anything I could get my hands on, I got my hands on. But that experience of loving that show, of loving to learn about that show, I read The Making of Star Trek was a seminal book in my life, which I got at a high school book fair, a junior high book fair, and read it over and over again obsessively. It was all about how they made the show. So I always wanted to know how the show was made, how they did that, what they did, what was the process, what were the decisions they made, why did they do that episode, why did that episode suck and that one was great. All those questions that fans want to know, I lived that. So when I finally crossed to the other side of the curtain and at Next Generation and could go to conventions and be on the stage, I had